Hi, this is Magda from Interiors Exteriors. Today we'll discuss inspecting apartments and houses from the developer. I invited Karolina Szuba to join this episode. She professionally inspects apartments and houses, and she'll answer our questions.
Hi, I'm Karolina. I run a renovation and finishing company, and I also handle inspections of properties from developers.
If you're curious about Karolina's experiences, be sure to check out our other video where we talked about what it's like to be a woman in the construction and renovation industry. And now let's move on to our topic. When does the apartment inspection take place?
The handover of the apartment can take place while construction is still ongoing, but it can also happen after the construction is completed, once the occupancy permit has been obtained. This is the moment when the developer must invite the buyer for the inspection, while a pre-inspection, which takes place while construction is still ongoing, is at the developer's discretion. They are not required to do this. However, some developers do allow buyers to take possession of the apartments earlier, so that, for example, finishing work can begin sooner, or at least measurements can be taken in advance, which will allow the interior designer to start designing.
About what should we remember when receiving the apartment?
During the handover, it's very important to check the technical condition, as it will have a direct impact later on what we can do in this apartment, what the costs will be, what problems may arise. So the handover is the moment when we should especially focus on the technical condition of the property.
What are the defects of the property and how can we report them?
The defects found in properties can be divided into obvious defects and hidden defects. Obvious defects are all those that we can see at first glance, or with the help of basic tools or equipment such as crooked walls, uneven floors, misaligned windows, and defects of this kind. On the other hand, hidden defects are those that the client or buyer is not able to see right away, even during the inspection. These are defects that usually appear after some time, such as leaks, poor insulation, thermal bridges, malfunctioning systems, or ventilation issues. They are often seasonal, and such defects can definitely be reported during the warranty period. During handover, the developer must prepare a property handover protocol. The buyer has the right to report defects in the property in the protocol. If these are minor defects, then generally the problem is smaller here. The developer simply has 14 days to respond to these defects. The developer has 14 days to respond to justified defects. However, if during the handover, which was introduced by the new developer law that came into effect on July 1, 2022, the buyer has the right to refuse to accept the property in the event of a significant defect, and if the developer's representative simultaneously refuses to acknowledge this defect. In the handover protocol, the buyer should clearly indicate which defects they consider significant. Ventilation, if
we refuse to accept the apartment.
If the buyer refuses to accept such an apartment due to a significant defect, the developer is obliged to set a new handover date and remove the significant defect, unless they still claim that the defect is not significant or that the defect does not exist at all. The buyer must show up for the next handover date. If the buyer finds during this handover that the defect still exists and is still significant, they have the right to call in a building expert at the developer's expense, provided that the expert actually confirms the presence of such a significant defect and determines during the handover whether such a defect really exists.
What exactly are defects?
According to the Civil Code, every seller is responsible for the item they sell to the buyer if, for example, that item has defects. Defects can be physical, defects can be legal. In the case of legal defects, there are actually several situations when these defects can occur. However, in the case of physical defects, the list is practically endless. Physical defects are defects that prevent you from using a given item in the way you should be able to use it. This applies to both movable and immovable items. Movable items, for example, when we buy a washing machine, a refrigerator, or any other appliance. And here, if the item has a defect, we can use the right of warranty and report the defect to the seller. In the case of real estate, we also have this option.
What is warranty? Warranty?
It's nothing more than the seller's liability to the buyer for the goods sold in the event of defects in those goods. The warranty period for real estate lasts 5 years. For movable goods, it lasts 2 years.
What rights does the buyer have?
The buyer is entitled to numerous rights under the warranty in the event of defects. This includes the possibility of repair and the possibility of replacement. You can't replace the entire property, but you can replace the elements that are part of the property and form a whole with it. Importantly, in the case of repair or removal of a defect, the warranty period starts anew for the elements that have been, for example, replaced or repaired. So here the warranty period begins again. And for example, if, let's say, a furnace or some part of the installation was repaired and it breaks down again within another 5 years, we have the possibility to report this fact to the developer again.
What is the difference between significant and insignificant defects?
Defects can be classified as significant or insignificant. This is especially important in connection with the introduction of the new developer law, under which, during the handover, if the buyer finds a significant defect, they can simply refuse to accept the property. Significant defects are not defined in Polish law, but court rulings define them as a non-conformity of the sold item to such an extent that it is impossible to use the item according to the seller's assurances. In the case of real estate, we can talk about such defects as, for example, a hole in the ceiling, active leaks, or severe dampness of large plaster surfaces, which make it impossible to continue finishing work and therefore to move into the property. Non-significant defects, on the other hand, are those defects that do not prevent the use of the property, meaning they are defects that can theoretically be easily removed. These include various types of cracks on the plaster surface, scratches on window panes, or, for example, chips in the plaster.
What should you focus on during the inspection?
During the inspection, we should primarily focus on reporting obvious defects and mechanical faults. In the case of mechanical faults, this is especially important because once we have received the keys to the property, the developer may not acknowledge such a mechanical fault, for example, a scratch on the window pane or damage to the entrance door. They might say that the keys have already been handed over to us and that the fault occurred afterwards. Only after we were already in possession of the property.
How do we report defects?
During the warranty period, defects should be reported to the developer immediately after they are discovered. Defects should be reported in writing, either by email or by letter, preferably by registered mail. The developer has 14 days to respond to the reported defects and 30 days to fix them. The 14 days are part of the 30 days. If it is not possible to fix the defect within 30 days, the developer has the right to extend this period by providing a reason and specifying a new deadline. If they don't actually fix it within that period, we have the right to set a deadline for the developer ourselves and fix the defect at the developer's expense. How
else can we assert our rights?
In addition to the warranty for defects, the buyer can also assert their rights under the guarantee, if one has been provided, as well as under liability for damages.
Who can we bring to the apartment handover?
It's worth bringing an engineer or generally a specialist who deals with such handovers to the apartment handover. who knows the standards, knows the legal regulations, has tools that allow checking the technical condition of the property, and who will simply point out all the defects in the apartment that they notice during such a handover. It's worth coming with the people who will be living in the apartment so that they can also check the technical condition and see what's important to them. However, it's not worth bringing a dozen additional people with you, like aunts, uncles, 3 specialists, and so on. Because in such a situation, more doesn't always mean better. It actually makes the work more difficult for both the developer and the specialist who is supposed to do the inspection. How much
time do we have to inspect our property during the handover?
Most often, the handover of the property takes about 1.5 to 2.5 hours. It all also depends on how much time the developer has allocated for the handover. However, most often about 2 hours is enough to check the technical condition of the property. There are no legal regulations that clearly state you can't do the handover all day or that you can only do it for an hour. However, this is a practice already used simply by developers who set the amount of time they have planned for the handover of a given property. We have to remember that the developer is handing over not only our unit but also many other units. That's why this time is simply limited.
That's all for this video. If you have any more questions, feel free to write them in the comments. And I want to thank Karolina for agreeing to appear in this episode and answer various questions.
Thank you, Magda, for inviting me. If you need a professional for an inspection in Warsaw or the surrounding areas, I recommend myself. Please visit www.pinkhelmet.pl, where you can read more about inspections. I also invite you to use our renovation and finishing services. Thank you. Link.
I'll add the link to Karolina's Pink Helmet Company in the video description. And now, I encourage you to leave a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and of course, I invite you to watch our other episodes, where you will find plenty of interior design inspirations, tips, and interesting ideas. See you next time. Bye.